Hello, this is Rob Berg with North Country History with Rob Berg, and today's episode is going to be on Michigan's lumber boom. And it's kind of the part two of the last episode, which was of the early beginning of the lumber era in Michigan. And now we're going to see the success of it, starting really in the 1860s, after the end of the Civil War, as kind of the normalcy in the United States resumed with the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. That led to a greater demand in lumber that was coming directly from Michigan. North Country History with Rob Berg, your podcast on the forest history of the Great Lakes region. So just to recap a little bit of what we talked about in the last episode, it was kind of the beginning of the lumber industry in Michigan, basically starting after the statehood in 1837 that allowed for the land surveys. Although there had been logging being done in Michigan during the territorial period and prior to that as both French and English colony as part of Canada or New France, and but that was all kind of for basic need. As Michigan became a territory in 1805, that same year Detroit burned, and there was the need to rebuild Detroit. So the utilization of lumber coming from that area of what's now Wayne, Oakland, Macomb counties, but also stretching up into the Thumb, using Port Huron as the first shipping place for lumber to be brought down the St. Lawrence River, the St. Clair River to Lake St. Clair, and the Detroit River to meet the needs of the growing community of Detroit. With the surveys of the state, that allowed for more areas to be accessed, both for settlement, but also for the extraction of lumber. And so this happened beginning slowly in the 1830s, becoming more of an industry in the 1840s and taking off in the 1850s, but slamming to a halt in 1861. There would be continued logging through the time period of the Civil War, but it was on a much, much smaller scale, with many of the men having volunteered for the Union Army. One particular regiment, the 20th Regiment, Michigan's 20th Regiment of Engineers and Mechanics, they were attached to the armies in Tennessee, Kentucky, Georgia, and did much work for rebuilding railroads, keeping those maintained. To do that, there would have had to be a lot of logging taking place for the construction of the bridges, the viaducts, and also for railroad ties. So there was an important use of the skills of the loggers who had joined the Union cause. But coming in after the Civil War, with the resumption of normal life, and I'm using air quotes that you can't see, nothing was normal after the Civil War, just like we've experienced with the pandemic. There is no normal anymore. But with the Homestead Act and the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, it meant a lot of people moving west. And with the movement west, that meant there was a great demand for lumber. The railroad consumed a lot of the lumber, and I will have an episode on railroad logging, both the use of the railroad for logging and the need for lumber for the construction of railroads. That might be a multi-part episode. But that also spread the growth out along that way. I lived in Nebraska for 4 years, from 2017 to 2021. And it was really interesting because I saw the results of the lumber, of where it went, and the use of that. And that also will be in a future episode. And I'm developing a program on that called From the Great Lakes to the Great Plains. and about the use of Michigan lumber and, well, Great Lakes lumber in the West. So all of this led to a growth of logging in Michigan. But what played a very important part was the geography of logging, or geography of Michigan, and how it related to logging. I had mentioned about using the Great Lakes, shipping lumber to the east on Lake Erie, and then to Buffalo, or the port was Tonawanda on the Niagara River, just below Buffalo. And that was where the Erie Canal entered the Great Lakes at. And then lumber was transferred to barges for canal boats to be taken down the canal to Albany, New York, the eastern terminus of the Erie Canal. And from there on the Hudson River, ships could reach all the way up to Albany, and then they could go down to New York City and then out to the Atlantic and along the Atlantic coast. So our lumber was important going east, but to go west also was utilizing the Great Lakes. At the southern end of the Lake Michigan, as I mentioned in the last episode, is the location of Chicago. And Chicago had started, just like many communities on the Great Lakes, Detroit, Mackinac Island included, as a fur trading post, and then also as a military site. The military didn't come until the Americans in the early 1800s and the construction of Fort Dearborn, but the site of Chicago had been a place for fur traders long before it was officially founded as a community. And that was the place where the Chicago River entered into Lake Michigan. And going up the Chicago River and then a portage to the DuPage, I think. I have to look this up. I should know this better. The DuPage River and the Des Plaines River. I'm not sure. Oh, it might be DuPage County, the Des Plaines River, and into the Fox River. And then that goes down to the Illinois River, which then flows into the Mississippi just above St. Louis. So this interconnected the Great Lakes with the Mississippi Valley. And so it was important for fur trade. And then it became important for transportation, for shipping. To ease that, the Illinois and Michigan Canal was connected in the 1840s, was completed, and that allowed goods to be shipped west from Chicago, which included lumber. Very early on in my career with the state of Michigan running the historic site, the Hartwick Pines Logging Museum at Hartwick Pines State Park, I was contacted by the National Trust for Historic Preservation, who operated the Gaylord Building in Lockport, Illinois. It was used as a visitor center on the Illinois and Michigan Canal. And in there they had exhibits, and one of them was on the lumber industry and the shipping of lumber to the West. And I got a chance to do a little bit of consulting with them on their exhibit that they were developing, looking at what they could include in their exhibit on lumber as part of how this affected the industries and the transportation and settlement of the West. So that was pretty cool for a young guy. I think I was in my first year still at Hartwick Pines. So we're looking 1998, 99 in that period. And then in 2001, I was able to finally get to Lockport and to the Illinois Michigan Canal and saw the Gaylord Building and saw the exhibits that I helped to consult on. So that was pretty cool. But this showed how the lumber was needed in the West. So this was a boom for Michigan. Starting really in the late 1860s is when you see the rise of the lumber industry in Michigan. It attracted many people coming to the state. You know, there were a lot of veterans who didn't know what they really wanted to do after the war was over. Now, many of them went west, worked on the Transcontinental Railroad, and settled in the West, homesteaded. But many did come north to work in the woods in Michigan and Wisconsin and Minnesota. And it was a good job, decent pay. It was $1 a day, basically what they made in most any other labor positions. But you had your room and board a bunk to sleep in the bunkhouse, the men's shanty, 3 meals a day, and usually they were quite hearty meals. Sometimes the quality was lacking depending on the camps, but it was not something that was deducted from your pay. You had received that along with your pay. And there was no place to spend your money while you were in camp, usually. There were a few, settlements close to the camps that they could go to the saloon and houses of ill repute and such. But for many of them, they got their money, and if they weren't getting paid monthly, that some camps did, they were getting paid at the end of the season. And so that was a nice, fairly decent amount of money to have in your pocket at the end of 5 months working in the woods. If you were making around $25 to $30 a month, then you might end up for that 5 months anywhere between $150 and $180. And those were for the so-called unskilled jobs, swinging an axe, pulling a saw, digging out roads. Those were the jobs that were the $1-a-day jobs that they had at the time. Blacksmiths, teamsters, those jobs would have been paid more because that was a more skilled labor. The working on the river drives, maybe $3 a day, but that was for a short period in the spring. It was a much more dangerous and skilled position. So this attracted men to the woods. So this really allowed for more cutting to be done when there was a demand, because you had now a population rise. Not to mention with a lot of immigration to the United States as well. Beginning of logging, we're looking at French Canadians, some Irish, Germans, but mostly then American or Canadian-born men. Post-war, post-Civil War, with the influx of immigration, you had a lot of Scandinavians coming into the United States, and into the forest, you had a lot of Swedes, Danes. I'll speak specifically about Danes when I do an episode on the Salling Hansen Company out of Grayling that was led by 3 men that were Danish immigrants. Nels Mikkelsen, who you'll learn more about along through this, because his history is a special interest of mine. Rasmus Hansen and Ernest Salling, along with others. But they were many men who came from Denmark. There were many Swedes involved in lumber, Norwegians, more Norwegians, I think, in Minnesota than here in Michigan, but we had our share. Also Finns, although they mostly went to the mines in the Upper Peninsula, working in the copper mines in the Keweenaw Peninsula, and along in some of the other mines in the Upper Peninsula, along into Wisconsin and Minnesota. But you had pretty much anybody who immigrated to the United States you might find in lumber camps. You had Italians, you had men from Eastern Europe, from areas that would become countries such as Hungary, Austria, Poland, the former Yugoslavia, so Serbian, Croatian, you had Czechs, you had Slovaks, you had Slovenians. All of these men worked in camps at various times, along with several camps in Michigan employed Native Americans. And even here and there, a handful of African Americans were found working in the lumber camps. Now, a logging camp could not be segregated. There just wasn't going to be a possible way to have African Americans living separately from the Europeans, Americans in the camps. So camps that did employ African Americans, which we know of a few that happened, these would have been very, progressive at the time, though I don't think progressive was a word that was considered for when they did employ African Americans. I know of at least one camp in Emmett County that had 2, possibly 3 African Americans in there based on a photograph I've seen. I've seen photos of an African American logger in the Grayling area. And I know of a man named Frank May, who was a ex-slave. He had been born and raised in Kentucky, and then lived on plantations in Kentucky and Louisiana and Texas through the Civil War, and was emancipated eventually. and found his way ending up in Michigan after spending some time back home in Kentucky and Louisville. And in Michigan, he worked in sawmills, and he figured out a way of how he could use some of the waste from the sawmills into being used for specialty products such as sashes for windows, different types of the kind of the extra ornamental work on homes. And he was able to then start a business with that. Ended up having a sawmill in Detroit and owned logging operations in Otsego County prior to his retirement around 1912. And then but this was amazing to find about a Black entrepreneur in the lumber industry who actually was considered a lumberman, such as the likes of Charles Hackley of Monroe and David Whitney of Detroit and David Ward and Rasmus Hansen and many others of these considered great men in lumber. And here was little old Frank Mays, not well known by any means, not nearly as wealthy as the rest, but he certainly had a fairly decent life. He was able to afford many things for he and his family and had property. Not only a home in Detroit, but had a farm in Oakland County. I'm sorry, not Oakland County. He was in Belleville, in western Wayne County, had a farm. And so he was well-to-do for an African-American man in Detroit at the turn of the century involved in the lumber industry. So there was all of these men working there available. But I mentioned the geography of Michigan and with the Great Lakes, but I failed to mention the rivers. And Michigan has a number of rivers, none of them very large. Our largest rivers in the state is the Grand River, which is somewhere around 220 miles long, not all that long. The Muskegon River, just a little bit less than that. And then you have smaller rivers such as the AuSable River, which is about I think from the headwaters north of Frederick in Crawford County down to AuSable River, or down to AuSable on Lake Huron, is probably about 150 miles, maybe a little bit more as the bends of the river. But it's not a long river. But what this allowed, though, is that lumber could be cut along these rivers and floated down to the sawmills at the mouths of the rivers. The best example, though, is the spider web of waterways that creates the Saginaw Valley. The Saginaw River itself is very short. It empties out at Bay City into Saginaw Bay, but it's formed in Saginaw just about, I think it's only about 25 to 30 miles upriver by water. And it's formed by where the confluence of the Shiawassee River and the Tittabawassee River as the main rivers coming into it. But from the Tittabawassee, you're getting the Tobacco River, the Molasses River, the Pine River, the Chippewa River. And from the Shiawassee River, you have the Cass River, the Flint River, the Bad River, the Salt River. I'm sorry, the Salt River flows into the Chippewa, and that goes into the Tittabawassee. But so you have numerous of these rivers that form together, but they spread out into all this great region of where the white pine could be cut, which if you can't see my hand, so I'll have to do a YouTube video of this. But I'm pointing to my mitten, my right hand, and drawing a line across at the bottom of the thumb at about Port Huron, up to around Saginaw Bay City, and across kind of a jagged line over to about Holland, although it comes down the coast a little bit along Lake Michigan. But everything north of that imaginary line is where the white pine grew in predominance. Not the only tree grown there, but it was seriously the most important tree grown at that time. And so there's those rivers. I also I failed to mention the Manistee River, the Paramarquette River, the Thunder Bay River, which also has a spider web of branches up in the northeastern part of the state. The Boardman River in Traverse City, it's not a long river, but it was an important one for logging. So just tons and tons of places of where logging could take place. And it was important. And this water system is what allowed you to cut, because logs are heavy and they're hard to move over land, but the white pine is rather buoyant and it floats very well. Now, does that mean every single log will get down to the mouth of the river? No, not really. There's going to be some that do get waterlogged, and they sink into the rivers there. Some of them are recovered, but some of them are still there at the bottom of rivers and lakes today. A number of years ago, there were a lot of logs that were found in Houghton Lake. At Houghton Lake, that's the headwaters of the Muskegon River. But there's a small river that connects Higgins Lake north of Houghton Lake down to Houghton Lake, and it's called the Cut, or the Cut River. And so where the Cut came into Houghton Lake, logs had to be rafted across the lake from the east side of the lake to the west side to where the Muskegon River begins. And when you rafted them in a large boom, logs would break loose from that boom at times. They'd kind of float around the lake until they got too waterlogged and they sunk to the bottom of the lakes. And there were people wanting to salvage the logs out of there, and it's been found that if you can get logs that have sat underwater for a century, if you can dry them out quickly, which kiln dryer is the way you would do that, and it would completely remove the water in a very fast time, it would not allow time for decay to happen. And that lumber would be as good as the day it was cut and when it was originally intended to be used. So this would have been fantastic old growth lumber that there's a market for. But Michigan has some very sensible bottomland laws that anything found on the bottoms of any of the waters that are part of the Great Lakes watershed, which is pretty much every body of water in the state of Michigan. I don't know if there's any that are not included in that. There's a couple in the far western Upper Peninsula that are part of the Wisconsin River watershed, which then eventually flows into the Mississippi. So I don't know the rules for that. But of the Great Lakes ones, that's all protected. And also the various native tribes that are still here in Michigan, the Ojibwa, the Odawa, they're very sensitive to any of disruption of the home waters, the ancestral waters of their people. And so none of these logs that have been down underwater there have been allowed to be harvested. So they're there still. And that's nice because it's something that we know that's part of our history. So I've really digressed, but our geography is important. And so I've mentioned, the rivers, and with Saginaw Bay and the Muskegon River, those were our two largest areas for logging in the lower peninsula. I'll get to the upper peninsula here, but I want to mention here that just to show of how important these areas were, is that Jeremy Keeler, a writer, and I know he's been an instructor at Delta College over in Saginaw. I don't know if he's still there. I should reach out to him. But he wrote the book Michigan's Lumber Towns, which was published in 1990 by the Wayne State University Press. And he mentions in there that by 1880, there were about 120 sawmills stretching along the Saginaw River between Saginaw and Bay City, and nearly 50 surrounding Muskegon Lake. And if you've been to Muskegon Lake is where the Muskegon River flows into. And then like many coastal waters or rivers there on Lake Michigan, where the outlet is, and then there's basically a lake is formed, and there's usually a sandbar, a shallow one, between that and Lake Michigan. And they would have to dig channels between those outlet lakes and into Lake Michigan. And so that happened in Muskegon and Manistee and many of these other areas along Lake Michigan, Ludington. So these were where the sawmills were located. And on Lake Michigan, that's important because right across from Muskegon is Milwaukee. That did use Michigan lumber, although Milwaukee and had its own resources there of the Wisconsin lumber. But then it was also easy shipping from Muskegon down to Chicago. So Saginaw and Bay City likewise had the same issue or same things, where although they didn't have to worry about with the outlets out of their lake into Great Lakes, in this case Lake Huron, Bay City's built right on the mouth of the Saginaw River into Saginaw Bay, a very large and mostly sheltered harbor for shipping in and out of. And it was when you're getting out into the main part of the lake at the tip of the thumb by Port Austin and across the way at Tawas was the sighting of lighthouses along with Charity Island, kind of right in the middle, approximately halfway between Tawas Point and Port Austin. And so this guided the boats in and out of Saginaw Bay and out into Lake Huron. So the geography, like I said, was very important. The demand in the west, the shipping of lumber out to through Chicago, out to places like Omaha, Nebraska, and along the Union Pacific Railroad further west. I lived in Grand Island, Nebraska, which was located right on the UP, the Union Pacific. It was what created the town there, was the construction of the railroad. And the museum I worked at, the Stir Museum of the Prairie Pioneer, we had Railroad Town, and it was a recreation of a small town that grew up along the railroad. And everything in that town, built of wood. Wooden sidewalks, wooden buildings, of course, wooden lampposts, telegraph poles. The railroad cars were all made out of wood. Pretty much everything, that was constructed, it was made of wood. And that was a resource that had to be shipped to them. Other than cottonwoods and the river bottoms, such as along the Platte River, there wasn't a great source of lumber. And those cottonwoods were cut quick by tie cutters for the railroad. But cottonwood was not going to last long for railroad ties, so then or any other construction used for the railroad. So they had to ship a greater quality of lumber, higher quality, from the east, from the Great Lakes, and that was white pine. Hemlock and cedar were used for railroad ties, so those were cut, but it was certainly the pine that was used very importantly. There's this great demand, and there's a growth here, so we need to start finding new ways to cut faster and to expand out of our logging area. The first way looking at to cut faster, there was a variety of technology that was developed, some in the forest and then also in the sawmills. In the sawmill, I'll go to first, was a faster and more efficient way to cut the logs into lumber. And early logging in the sawmills, the lumber industry would have used up and down sawmills, up and down saws that were basically a long saw blade. Think of a long, like crosscut saw, and it's attached at the bottom and the top to a wooden mechanism, and that was powered by water, a water wheel or a water turbine located below the mill in the water source. It was either a stream, a river, or more likely a mill race, a man-made, a created channel, usually boxed in wood, drawing water off from a dammed mill pond on a stream. And that water, when gates would be open, would flow down fast through that mill race, and that would power the water wheel that was setting in there. And that could then power the saw up above. And that was a good place to see that is Mill Creek, outside of Mackinac City, part of the Mackinac State Historic Parks. And that one dates back to, I believe, was the early 1800s that one was established by Michael Dousman. But you'll certainly learn more about that if you get a chance to visit that. It's a site opened during the summer season, and I highly recommend it to see what it was like in that early logging lumber era. But sorry, we need to advance on. That was replaced by circular saws, the big, large wheels with the saw teeth on them, and they would be attached in the center to a bar that was powered by a large leather belt attached to a steam engine. And as that belt that was being turned by the steam engine, that would be able to turn the saw. And of course, you wanted it to go rapidly, as fast as possible, but the faster it turns, that saw, because it's attached in the center, and it might be, we're looking at, for the largest ones, a 6 to 8 foot diameter saw blade that it's going to start wobbling on the ends very fast. And what that does, it causes a much wider cut, or what they call the kerf, and that would be such a problem that you would be losing a lot of good lumber by the several cuts that you would have to go through a log to cut the large planks that were coming off of it. You were losing quite a bit of lumber out of there. And it was faster than the water-powered saws, but it was still pretty slow compared to what would come. And by the 1870s into the early 1880s, the top technology available had become band saws. And a band saw was one continuous belt, metal belt with saw teeth on it. It was one large giant saw blade, maybe 20 feet long, connected. So it's one single loop, and it's on pulleys, one on top and one below. And below is where it would be powered, the mechanisms coming from the steam engine that was located adjacent to the sawmill, and using, again, large, long leather belts. And that would be operating the mechanisms, and it would continuously use the saw to cut. And the way it was made, and it was nice and taut, so it was tight. It did not wobble at all like the circular saws, and it made a very clean cut and very fast. And this allowed for lumber to be cut extremely quick. The logs, you could not keep up to the demand in some sawmills, and especially if they were ones that were working two shifts, a day shift and a night shift, and a shift was usually about 12 hours or close to 12 hours. You might have a short break in between shifts for changeover of the crews and a chance to clean the blades of the saws, because as they're cutting through the lumber there, it's green lumber. It's going to have a lot of resin or sap in there, and that would get very sticky on the blade, so that would have to be cleaned frequently. So you're looking at a 10 to 12 hour shift and continuous cutting through that time period each day. And so you could see the lumber could be cut very fast. So that means we need to spread out our cutting. We need to cut faster. We need to cut year-round if possible. But you couldn't cut year-round when you were just using the rivers, because our rivers they don't dry up completely in Michigan. We're not like the arid West. But after the snow melt, after the spring thaws, our rivers do start to run a little bit shallower. They run slower with less volume of water in there, because all that winter melt, that water has reached the Great Lakes usually by the end of May. In some years, it may take a little bit longer, as it takes longer for the forests and swamps to dry out, and water is still draining out, flowing out through the streams to the rivers and down to the lake. But by June for sure, the river drives are done, and there's no way to move any logs that got left in the forest to the sawmills until the next springtime. And that means you're going to lose money. So there were a few different attempts to adapt railroads into the use of logging. And there was one that was not a true railroad, although there are its supporters who put it up there as the first lumber railroad, and it was at Blandon's Landing, which is now where Grand Valley State University is on the Grand River near Allendale, west of Grand Rapids. And that used kind of a wooden tram with some metal rails on there as well, but it was not a steam-powered locomotive such as the modern or the railroads that we think of mostly. But that was used to move logs for a short bit, but only to the river. So it was still part of that winter logging using the rivers. In the early 1870s in Bay County and what became Aranac County, was some logging railroads done around Pinconning. And that one had a much more potential for taking off. But the Panic of 1873, an economic depression, pretty much shut it down. And then the following panic in 1876, the centennial year, that one killed it completely. And that was, but that is considered the first real logging railroad in Michigan. But the first successful one came about the time that the Pinconning-Glencoe Railroad, the one in Pinconning, died. And that was Scott Garish, a lumberman out of Clare County. And he had visited the Centennial Exposition, the World's Fair, as we call them today, in Philadelphia in 1876. And while he was at that fair, he saw Baldwin locomotives, which were narrow gauge locomotive engines. And they were used in the coal mining operations in the Allegheny Mountains in Pennsylvania and West Virginia, and used to get the coal out of the mines in the mountains down to the processing plants further downhill from them. And I've seen some of these railroads. I spent a summer in 1996 in the Allegheny Mountains in Pennsylvania doing an internship, and one of the places was called the East Broadtop Railroad, and that was used to take coal from the mines of the East Broadtop coal mine company to Mount Union, the town I was located in, and that was where it connected to the main Pennsylvania railroad line. And but so these narrow gauge railroads, because they were lightweight, they were smaller, you didn't have to put as much expense into the construction of those railroads. They were the ones that were used to move that coal. And so Garish saw this and he thought, aha, I've got my way that I can take lumber from more than 6 miles from the Muskegon River, which is pretty much was the extent that you wanted to haul logs on sleds pulled by horses. Horses, I mean, they're a beast. They can pull 10 times their own weight on a good iced road. So if you had a large team that was a ton or more in total weight between them. So say we're going to look at a 1,500-pound horse, two of them, 3,000 pounds together. That would be extreme for sizes of horses. So there were some that were, I've read that have been larger, up to 4,000 pounds for the whole team. But we'll stick at 3,000 pounds for the team. 10 times their own weight on a well-groomed iced road. The sleds running on the metal rails on a road of ice. Those horses could pull upwards of 30,000 pounds of logs there. So that was a lot that they could do, but you work them any further than that 5 or 6 miles, you're going to risk the health of the horses, the injuries to them. Horses, they used up a lot of horses, but they were considered more valuable than the men. They were harder to replace than loggers. If you were hurt in the woods We're really sorry, but hey, we just had 3 more men come into camp looking for work. But you lose a team of horses, that's going to be part of your output. And it's not so easily to just go out and hire a brand new team that's experienced. And if you lose one horse out of that team, that solo horse isn't going to be able to do the work. So even if one horse is injured, you've really taken out 2 horses for that team. So he knew that he couldn't just haul the logs by horse for the longer distance, but he could, if he had the capital, build a railroad, purchase a Baldwin locomotive, cars to be pulled behind that, and you could then haul logs that way. And his thought was to do this in the wintertime, get the logs to the Muskegon River, get them from further away and get them there faster than his competitors. And as long as he could get the logs into the rivers first in the season or early on, then they're going to get down to Muskegon, get to the mills, and he'll get top dollar as being the first logs in and the more logs in than his competitors. And everybody looked at him like, you're crazy, Scott. Why are you doing this? Because it's just a waste of money. There's no need to use a railroad. Horses are fine. Well, what happened in the winter of 1876-77 was a mild winter. We have a lot of mild winters now, but at one time, you were looking at, winter lasting not, December through February, but November to March to April. And I lived in Grayling for 18 years, and I saw some of our worst snowstorms in March. So it's definitely was something that could happen. But that year, there was hardly any snow, which means most of the other logging camps could not get their logs out of the forest. They were stuck in the forest. They couldn't get them to the Muskegon River. They couldn't get them to Muskegon. And so you had somebody like Scott Garish, who certainly beat out all of his competitors that year. And many of them saw this. It's like, hey, we could do this. And then looking at the demand of lumber, and it's like, we don't need winter to move the logs. We can take the logs to the main rail line, and there were a number of them coming up into northern Michigan now by the 1870s. You had the Père Marquette that was cutting across from Flint and eventually over to Ludington on Lake Michigan, and it was coming up through Saginaw and Midland and Mount Pleasant and along all the way to Ludington there. So that was a good one to go across the state that way. And going north, you had the Detroit and Mackinac Railroad that went along the lakeshore, along Lake Huron. You had the Michigan Central Railroad that had owned several lines that came up through the middle of the state, going up through Saginaw and Midland and going up to Roscommon and Grayling and Gaylord and up to Sheboygan and Mackinac City. You had the Illinois and Grand Rapids Railroad, the Indiana and Grand Rapids Railroad that came up through the west side of the state and cut up through Grand Rapids and went all the way north up to Petoskey and eventually to Mackinac City. So all of these lines could be utilized to take logs directly to the mills. And after they've been cut at the sawmills, directly to places like Chicago and transferred to further west, or cutting out the middleman in Chicago, some did, and taking the logs or the cut lumber, the finished lumber, directly to markets. So the railroad really revolutionized this. And you could cut anywhere and you could cut year round. However, with the railroad, it's not cheap. You have to buy the steel or be in contract with a railroad company who can build the rails. So you have to lay out the railroad lines. You have to build the railroad tracks. You have to buy or lease the equipment, the locomotives, and the cars. So that was certainly important, and that was expensive. And originally it was these Baldwin engines that were used, which are good, but they weren't ideal. And in Michigan kind of became the center for a lot of technological development in this time period because we had become the leading state for lumber. Certainly by the end of the 1860s, Michigan had surpassed Pennsylvania, the previous leader, to become the leading lumber state. And so we had a lot of entrepreneurs who were involved in the lumber industry. And one of them in Herring Township, just north of Cadillac, was a man named Ephraim Shea. And Ephraim Shea, he had owned a general store and he dabbled in lumber. And he saw, probably being inspired by Scott Garish, because it was right around that time, 1877, 78, that he invented what's known as the Shea locomotive. And instead of a traditional locomotive engine, which if you think about it in your mind, look at it, has the large wheels on it with the rods on the side, the pistons that would then be connected to a drivetrain. And that would, as the wheels turn, it's moving that piston, and that's causing the train to move, using steam as the power for that. But Shea saw that needed more steam to get up to speed to move it. And if you're going uphill or you're going around tight bends, it would be very difficult to use one of those. So he created what's called an articulated engine. And it was almost like on hinges. And instead of one long drivetrain that went from the big wheels in the back up to the smaller wheels in front to help power it, and using the pistons on the sides, he had them running on gears directly underneath. Now, this is very techno, or kind of it goes over my head a lot of times, but there's hopefully audience out there who knows exactly what I'm talking about and could probably explain it 100% time better than I am. But these gears underneath were going back and forth from one side to the other, and they were building up the steam. So you could go up a steeper grade. You could go around tighter bends. So some areas, the geography would not have allowed for even the standard type of narrow gauge railroad. But you needed these Baldwin or these Shea locomotives. And Shea's engine was adopted for use in the coal mines in the east, in West Virginia, became very popular area in the Allegheny Mountains for using them. So kind of where Garish got the idea of the Baldwin locomotives from the coal mines in the east, bringing that technology to Michigan. Well, Shea then, in turn, his technology was then adapted by miners in the east, but also in the west in the Rocky Mountains. And Shea locomotives were used all over in the United States and across all over the world too. Ephraim Shea, he wisely sold the rights for the manufacturing of his engine to a railroad company in Ohio. I think it was the Lima Engine Works. Again, not my area of expertise. So railroad whizzes can certainly correct me on this. But Shea, he would not have been able to keep up with the demand for the construction of these locomotives. So he sold the rights to him, and he retired as a very wealthy man and moved up to Harbor Springs, where he settled in as basically an inventor. He invented a all steel hulled, steam powered boat that they've restored recently in Harbor Springs. The house that he built for himself was all steam heated in there, so he always liked to tinker using steam power. And a very interesting person. And they have a restored Shea locomotive in the city park in downtown Cadillac on the shores of Lake Mitchell there in Cadillac, as I mentioned. So all of this great technology was very important for the speeding up of lumber in Michigan. But as I mentioned, this was not cheap. And the way to pay for that was you had to cut more. You had to cut faster. Now, the railroad allowed that, and you could cut year-round. But what that meant is your largest white pines were now disappearing very fast. And by the 1880s, there was a very big concern about the loss of the forests in Michigan. So that not only the white pine were they cutting, but they cut the red pine, they cut spruce, they cut cedar, they cut hemlock, they cut maple, oak, beech, elm, ash, all these hardwood species that would never have floated on rivers. They were now available, and Grand Rapids became the leading furniture maker in the world, using a lot of this hardwood furniture or hardwood lumber. But also that hardwood could be used for wood paneling, wood flooring. So there was a lot of great uses that they could use for the hardwood as well. So they cut that. But they also were no longer cutting the biggest trees. They were cutting trees as small as 10 inches, 12 inches diameter, even 8 inches diameter. I've read the records of the Salling-Hansen Company in 1896. In Grayling, they had an order by a German shipbuilding company for 8 to 10 inch logs that could be used for spars, for ships, for masts, or not the masts, they needed larger ones, but for the cross ties on there. And so those were important elements that they needed. Those were specialty orders, but they found that they had the trees to use that, so or to fill that, so they cut there. So they were cutting everything. And the last piece of technology that allowed this was the crosscut saw. Now, crosscut saws have existed for centuries. I don't know when the first crosscut saw was invented, but by the 1870s, they were still not being used as the primary saw or way of cutting trees down. The axe was, because the saw lacked a good way of removing the sawdust out of the cut when you're cutting laterally into the tree, or horizontally into the tree, that sawdust just stays right in that cut there. That had to be pulled out or removed, or the teeth would bind in there, especially with sappy wood. Your pine's very sappy. So you'd have to stop. You'd have to get a long knife or an awl in there and kind of clear that out. Wipe down your saws with kerosene. That would get the resin, the sap off of it to make it cut easier. And so you could cut trees down with it, but it was not beneficial. Or it was not, I shouldn't say beneficial, it wasn't really lucrative to do. 2 men cutting with an axe could cut a good-sized trees down in a half hour. With a saw at that time, I don't think they could even cut as fast as with an axe. But in the 1870s, an inventor in Philadelphia patented a tooth for the saw called a raker tooth. It did not cut. And if you look at a diagram of a crosscut saw with a raker tooth, it looks like a little bit of an M or kind of an inverted V in there. And instead of having the tooth going out, it kind of goes in. Oh, that wasn't good. And so what they would have done is that that tooth pulls the sawdust out of the cut. So it's basically cleaning the cut, cleaning the kerf out of there while they are sawing. And now, instead of 2 men with an axe taking a half hour, 2 men with a saw were cutting a tree in 15 minutes. So you went from 2 trees an hour to 4 trees an hour. On a 10-hour work day, you went from 20 trees a day to 40 trees a day. So you're not only cutting year-round, cutting farther out from the river so you can cut anywhere that you could not reach previous, but now you're cutting twice as fast. And instead of cutting the crews down to having fewer men out there working because of the output that they could do, they actually were hiring more and more men because they needed to cover the costs of the railroads and still continue to make a profit. So by the end of the 1890s, our forests were virtually disappeared, and the need for reforestation was beginning. I want to read a couple of numbers here as kind of comparison between the 1840s and the 1880s and 1890s. In the 1840s, now I used a quote from Hunt. What was the name of him? Yeah, I can't believe I'm forgetting this right now. Freeman Hunt in the Merchants Magazine and Commercial Review in 1848, he talked about in Michigan that generations will cease to live before this will cease to be a branch of commerce, a vast resource of what he's talking about, the Michigan lumber. And at that time, the next sentence of that is the trade already employs hundreds of mills, some 30 vessels, and several hundred men. So you're looking at that was 1848. So I'm going to jump to 1885. And Charles Ellis, who's also writing in Chicago for the Current magazine in 1885, his article Among the Michigan Pines, he says, in the lumbering industries of the United States, there are said to be 90,000 men employed in mills and 135,000 in the forest. The wages of these men amount to $80 million annually. The capital investment in the industry is placed at $180 million, and the value of the annual product is $230 million. The farmers of the country receive for supplies furnished to lumbermen $30 million a year. And then he goes on to say that the state of Michigan has invested in mill property and apparatus for lumbering $40 million. She employs 20,000 men in her mills and 30,000 in her forest, paying them annually about $15 million. She pays farmers for produce $5 million a year, and she pays mechanics annually about $4 million a year. These would be the men working in the mills, kind of keeping everything working, the sawyers, the repairmen, the blacksmiths, all of those type of men. Her product of pine lumber has been for several years averaging about 5 billion feet, that's board feet, a 1 square foot board, worth $60 million. The state has produced in all about 40 billion feet of pine lumber. So that's 1885. In 18, where is it here? I'm looking at, 1898, George W. Hotchkiss, his History of the Lumber and Forestry Industry of the Northwest. And by Northwest, he meant the Great Lakes region. The value of Michigan lumber in 1897, since the industry began, $2,649,175,000. That is opposed to the value of California gold industry in 1897 as $1,340,000,000. Sorry, there's no hundreds of thousands of dollars in that one. So you're looking at basically a 2-to-1 of Michigan versus Chicago gold rush, or Chicago versus California gold rush. So there was a nickname for Michigan's white pine, and it was green gold. And here for the amount of wages paid for labor in Michigan. Cutting and hauling, the woods work is $484,425,000. River driving and booming, $161,475,000. Sawing and shipping, this would have been the sawmill work and transporting the finished lumber. This would include using railroads, $645,900,000. Total of that would be $1,291,800,000. So that was the wages, and then the amount of value above that would make it that $2,649,000,000. So you can see the value of lumber in Michigan was extraordinary. And that is really why this was such an important industry. But unfortunately, it was not an infinite resource, as many believed at the start of the lumber industry. It was finite. It took less time to cut than what they ever imagined because of this boom of technology. And so these great lumbermen, they had to change industries, or they had to move on to other locations, which many of them did. Michigan lumbermen continued in the Great Lakes region in Wisconsin and Minnesota that were slower to end. Some of them jumped all the way to the west to the Pacific Northwest, Washington and Oregon and Northern California, and logging in the Rockies along the way there. Some went south, Arkansas, East Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, and Mississippi. Those were logging regions, along with northern Georgia and North Carolina and a little bit of South Carolina. So different tree species, but it was all lucrative. So Michigan lumber, just as the beginners came from places like Pennsylvania, New York, Maine, New Brunswick, and Quebec, Michigan then exported their knowledgeable, experienced lumbermen to other locations. Along with them, the loggers, the shanty boys, as they called themselves, the lumberjacks, as we call them today, they followed. They went to those other locations too, or they got into other industries. Thankfully for Michigan, there was never a kind of a loss of the economy when the lumber industry ended, because it was at the same time as the rise of the auto industry. Now, unfortunately, many of those men who made a life for themselves in the woods in the northern lower peninsula or the upper peninsula, they had to find a new way to work or a new place to work, and many of them ended up in Detroit, in Pontiac, in Flint, in places that were Lansing, in places that were the new beginnings of the automobile industry. And so they migrated down that way. I have a few friends whose families, even as late as the 1960s, had moved from the Upper Peninsula to the Lower Peninsula, mostly southeast Michigan, to work in related jobs in the auto industry, because that is where our economy was being driven. Now we're seeing the industrial Michigan economy, and it's making its way back in different areas, but it's not quite like it was, in the through much of the 20th century when the auto industry was king here. So this was not the same with the lumber industry, and even after with reforestation, some of that came back. But again, those are whole different episodes. But today, this was a long episode, I know. We're looking at about 1 hour here right now of me talking, and it, though, really is foundational, though, to show how important lumber was to Michigan. And as I've said to many a school group, to many a program over the years, that the white pine industry was to Michigan in the 19th century, as the auto industry was to Michigan in the 20th century. It is the industry that drove our economy. Iron and copper mining were very important, particularly in the Upper Peninsula regions where those mines were at. But they led to industrialization in other parts of Michigan and the world. But what sustained us through all of that time was the lumber industry. It was located through most of our state. And once hardwoods were available to cut, it really did touch all of our state. So this was an important industry. And I want to hit this lumber industry early on in my podcast, because if we're talking forest history in the Great Lakes region, the most important thing we need to talk about is the lumber industry, because it changed our forests. Not so much for the good, mostly for the bad by them disappearing. But it's the key, the cornerstone of talking forest history in the Great Lakes. And so I'll continue through most of this first season talking about the lumber industry. And so with the next episode, I'm going to talk about winter logging. And we'll talk about how important that was through not only the early part of logging, where it was the only way to do it, but throughout our entire lumber industry, because even with the railroads, it was still cheaper to cut logs in the wintertime and move them by water. And so the last log drives on the rivers in Michigan they still occurred up until the early 1900s. So thanks for listening today. And I know it was kind of disjointed in places and going off on tangents, but you're getting an idea of how my mind thinks. And I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, please tell a friend. And this is the best way for word to spread about the North Country History with Rob Berg, my podcast, but more importantly, about learning about one of our great resources, our forests, and how we have affected that forest and how they have affected us. So thanks for listening, and we'll be back very soon with winter logging. Have a good evening. Have a good day, whatever time you're listening to. Thanks for listening. Bye. North Country History with Rob Berg is hosted, written, and produced by Rob Berg. Music is Crack o' Dawn, performed by Reveille, licensed through Soundstripe. Follow North Country History with Rob Berg on YouTube and on Facebook at Rob Berg, Environmental Historian.